post the April 2011 elections, many saying that what we're now looking at is an ongoing political evolution. What tone do you see the passing of this relatively peaceful election having set for the country's economic progress from here on out?
Well, I think what we hope is that a new president who's already been in power for a year prior to this election can hit the ground running very fast. I think people know what needs to be done in Nigeria. Fixing the power sector is obviously a crucial one, but reform of the energy sector and the NNPC is also there. So I think what we're really looking for now is that he uses that period, a relatively peaceful election of which there are unlikely to be significant legal challenges as a result of, to hit the ground running and get a quick grasp on moving ahead with the implementation of this long over-needed policies. And I mean, they have a clear blueprint which they should be able to start implementing pretty soon.
The operative words there being clear blueprint, David, because we've had this discussion when the various candidates for the elections released their manifestos, saying that it's one thing having it on paper, another thing actually following through. How are you rating capability to follow through with the blueprint?
Yes, that's a long-standing issue that's come, and we can point to other reforms in Nigeria which have not been implemented to date. I mean, we can look, say, the most visible one would be gas flaring, which various governments have had a commitment to reducing to zero and have not achieved. What I think, though, at this time is that we are seeing not just a blueprint, but they've been very active in terms of government in getting out, getting people interested in this. Just before the election, they announced a series of bidders for both the distribution and the generating side. So I think we have seen not only a blueprint but some clear progress in achieving it. Of course, I think we all will say that the proof is in the pudding in this case, but it does look quite positive, or more positive than it has looked probably since the re-election of President Obasanjo in 2004.
Well, when it comes to what's been set out on paper, we had the most recently published medium-term expenditure framework set out a clear plan to reduce the fiscal deficit through cuts in capital spending. Have viable or achievable targets been set in your books in that regard?
I think on the fiscal side, certainly, I mean, there's two sides to Nigerian policy that we want to think about here. The first are the underlying structural reforms of the power sector or the oil and gas sector. The second is to bring the fiscal policy, monetary policy framework back into a degree of control or order. On the fiscal side, it's very clear that capital spending rose very sharply in 2010 in the run-up to the elections. And bringing that back or cutting that back should be a relatively straightforward exercise. The reality is that when capital spending in a country like Nigeria tends to escalate, they tend to lose control of it sometimes, and so cutting out that waste and bringing it down to a more manageable level, given the capacity constraints in the ministries, is a relatively straightforward task. At the same time, we also see that with the banking sector crisis behind us, hopefully we can move on and see a shift in monetary policy framework to support that fiscal framework, and to aim more perhaps at bringing the inflation rate down under or into high single digits, low double digits in Nigeria.
So where we talk of potential shift back to a more normal monetary policy, how exactly are you defining that for the road ahead?
I think that's very difficult in the Nigerian context. I mean, normally for a central bank, their main role is fighting inflation, and that certainly is a policy priority in Nigeria. But the Nigerian central bank, like many other African central banks, probably has a sort of a wider remit, a broader remit, and has complementary but often contradictory goals. So they're looking at bringing inflation under control. Recently, the focus is on restoring the health of the financial system. They are also worried about the exchange rate and also the growth of credit within the economy and trying to boost that. So I think you can say that what you see is that monetary policy sort of changes its focus slightly, whereas in the last few years the focus was more on helping the financial system and reforming the banking system than fighting inflation. We're now going to see that emphasis shift more towards fighting inflation. But the goals of maintaining exchange rate stability or ensuring that the financial sector doesn't have another crisis, will both remain very important for the governor.
Well, with Nigeria's election cycle short, as you just touched on at the beginning of our discussion, events this time around have also set up a potentially fascinating poll come 2015. What's your outlook in that regard, David?
I think it'll be very interesting going into 2015. Yes, you're right, Nigeria's election cycle is very short, and I think what we're going to see is that if President Jonathan, Goodluck Jonathan, is determined to stick to only serving one term in office, as he said, very quickly the PDP will have to start thinking about who it wants to select as its candidate. And this whole zoning argument will come back into it, and the most likely outcome is that they will select a northern candidate. But there is a possibility this time round that while they busily sort out who they want to select as their candidate, one of the opposition parties, particularly perhaps the Action National Congress, can push ahead with consolidating the gains that it made in its elections. Perhaps it will bring on board one of the more popular southern governors, the governor of Lagos State, Mr. Fashola, and perhaps therefore it could mount a nationwide challenge this time round that really gives the PDP a run for its money, and that will make it a very fascinating election going forward, especially with the ground rules being set this time that, you would expect a similarly free and fairest election come 2015.
David, just wrapping up this discussion, challenges for Nigeria as you see it, where they've really got their work cut out for them in the next year.
Yes, I think, as a government, if you don't make changes within the first 6 to 9 months, it becomes much harder after that. So you would really be looking this year to get things done. Let's see if this power sector privatisation really can move ahead. Let's see if they can bring out some concrete proposals acceptable to all sides for reform of the NNPC. Let's see if they can bring inflation down into single digits, high single digits. I think that all would be positive signs for investors in looking at Nigeria and thinking of whether they're going to put their money there in the coming 12 months.